Welcome to Back Pocket Universe. I'm Elliot. I like to review vintage science fiction paperback books, and this video is reviewing Envoy to New Worlds by Keith Laumer. The cover, which is partially missing and depicts these sort of interesting variety of alien creatures, describes the main character, Jamie Retief, as the Machiavelli of cosmic diplomacy. The character struck me more as I was reading the stories as the James Bond of cosmic diplomacy. The stories all involve this character, Jamie Retief, who is a diplomat in the Terran Diplomatic Corps. And so they are on all sorts of different planets in the 28th century, serving Earth's various diplomatic purposes. The issue at hand is that, without exception, every one of Retief's diplomatic colleagues are ambitious, petty, unscrupulous, willfully ignorant, corrupt, and incompetent. And so this main character, Retief, is always swooping in to save the day, avoid a diplomatic incident or something of the sort by thwarting and undermining the machinations of his colleagues and taking action when they refuse to. And so this is a collection of stories about this character, Jamie Retief. This is actually the first collection of stories about this character. Turns out that Keith Laumer wrote about this character in dozens and dozens of stories over about 30 years. This was published in 1963. I don't believe that it contains the first story about this character, if I understand it correctly, but it contains some of the earliest stories. I liked the wittiness of the way that this book was written. I liked that it depicted some very interesting alien worlds and alien cultures. The author enjoys describing cultures that are unlike human cultures and that have their own sensibilities and motivations that don't correspond necessarily to those of Earthlings. And one of the consistent failings of Retief's colleagues is that they absolutely do not care at all about really understanding the nature or culture of the planets that they're serving on in any way. It's really quite remarkable. Every single one of his superiors is depicted as taking the diplomatic position on the planet as sort of a political formality and giving not one whit for the customs or sensibilities of the planet on which they're serving. They'll just sort of cozy up with whatever the existing power on the planet is and will remain willfully ignorant to whatever the various dynamics going on in the background are. And so Jamie Retief, being hyper competent and intelligent and motivated, simply cannot abide by this. And in every single story, he's getting into all sorts of trouble and also avoiding various interplanetary incidents by thwarting the schemes or the laziness of his superiors. The structure ends up being rather formulaic then, because without exception, Retief's associates are incompetent. And without exception, Retief himself is hyper confident. And sorry, I mean hyper competent. He always knows exactly what to do. He always knows exactly what to say. He always knows the language and customs of his planet, of the planet that he's on, in precise detail. He always has an encyclopedic knowledge of the history and current political climate of the planet. He employs an amazingly vast skill set. And when he comes down to it, he is able to scrap with the best of them, um, and use whatever weapon or two-fisted methods he needs to use to get the job done. And so Retief is really portrayed as this James Bond style character who whose main characteristic is unwavering confidence that he knows what to do and is doing the right thing, and unwavering competence, always knowing exactly what to do. To me, that makes the stories a little bit one note. I would like to see a more nuanced character. I'd like to see a character that's wrong sometimes and right sometimes. And I'd like to see a little bit of a nuance in the situations that he's facing as well, just in terms of his diplomatic associates not being always completely wrong and completely incompetent all the time. And maybe some situations that are a little bit gray, where it's hard to tell who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. You don't get any of that in this story. This is, you know, fairly straightforward action, uh, somewhat pulpy action adventure stories with sort of a diplomatic veneer. These were apparently inspired by the author Keith Laumer's um, experience in the Foreign Service in, I don't know, maybe the 1940s or 50s. And apparently, whatever happened to him there left a bitter enough taste in his mouth that he was able to draw on his his disillusionment of the diplomatic system for many years and many stories. I found myself not really able to connect with it. I could see the situation that he was posing in terms of lazy and incompetent diplomats, but it's not something that I have ever personally experienced or seen the effects of in a personal way myself. And so, what I could see the situation that he's posing, it didn't really come across to me as a commentary that I could apply to any area that I'm familiar with. Um, this book reminded me a little bit in concept of the story The Candlelighter in Frederick Pohl's collection that I reviewed last video, The Case Against Tomorrow, which is almost an inverse of what takes place in Envoy to New Worlds, because that involves a revolutionary and idealistic diplomat who is given a post on Mars, and while he's there, discovers that his high-minded ideals about right and wrong and oppression and all these different things had nothing at all to do with the actual diplomatic situation on Mars and the actual culture that he thought that he was defending. And so it was a much more nuanced story with much more gray shaded tones and complicated characters. I'm referring to the Candlelighter now. And I found that overall to be more enjoyable than the very straight laced one note story here in um, Envoy to New Worlds. There's obviously a lot more to read about this character Retief. I was surprised to find that Laumer continued to write about the character into the 80s, to the very end of his career, and there were actually some stories written about him by other authors as well. So obviously, he does have something of a fan base, and so my opinion is just my opinion in that regard. But wait, that's not more. This is actually a an ace double. So the other book that will be reviewing today is Flight from Yesterday by Robert Moore Williams. Now, this was a very pulpy story. The pulp background of the author really shows through in this one. The basic premise of this story is that it's about a group of unscrupulous criminal refugees who are escaping from a doomed outpost of Atlantis through time in sort of a metaphysical way. It's a little bit of a quantum leap thing where these criminals are escaping forward forward through time by putting their minds in the bodies of people that are in the present day of the story, which is the future. uh, as far as 1963 is concerned, it actually takes place in Los Angeles in the year 1980. Um, it is also This was also published in 1963, so for that time, Los Angeles of 1980 was the future, and so you've got these criminals um, metaphysically traveling forward in time from a few thousand years in the past into the not too distant future of 1980 and causing all sorts of problems. The, the primary motivation of the main villain, Kuthu, seems to be simply to escape the fate of the Atlanteans and to get as rich as he can. um, the the real hallmark of this story is that everything is so loosely strung together that it's really difficult to comprehend the motivations of any given character at any given time. Um, it is it is very pulpy, and I like pulp. I have no problem at all with pulp. It reminded me more than anything of an old uh, episodic serial, like the old serials that they would have played before movies in the 1940s. It was very much constructed like that, where you have sort of like thinly constructed plot points, um, punctuated by action sequences enacted by extremely boilerplate, one dimensional characters. And that is very much the structure of this story, to the extent that, as someone who watches quite a few old serials, even though this was written in 1963 and takes place in 1980, in my mind, it was all in grainy monochrome. And the characters were dressed like characters in a 1940s serial. I just couldn't unsee that because the plot structure was so reminiscent of it. And so you have these very predictable, kind of goonish villains that have projected themselves into bodies in the present, and you have these two very cookie cutter protagonists, a young man and a young woman. The young man is an out of work test pilot, of all things. Um, they are introduced to the story in uh, a sequence or with motivations that are very quickly forgotten, and sort of haplessly make their way through a very loosely constructed story along those lines. Um, it was fun to read. The idea of the Atlanteans projecting themselves forward through time into the bodies of other people was sort of novel and kind of an interesting concept. And you actually also went back in time during a portion of the book to see what it was like in this ancient outpost of Atlantis. Nothing particularly new or interesting there, but the story in that sense kind of went to a few different times and places. And as I mentioned in almost every single video, I do like deep time. I like the idea of the distant past and the distant future intersecting with each other and stuff like that. In this particular case, it sort of fell flat to me. Um, One of the major things that struck me about Flight from Yesterday is that it seemed to be very hastily written and very, very poorly edited. And so there was just this sort of a sloppiness to it that I couldn't quite get over. Um, just an astonishing number of loose ends. It seems like there are more concepts and plot points uh, introduced and unresolved than are resolved over the course of the story. The other thing that confused me about it is I could see absolutely no reason why it was set in the not too distant future of 1980. There's a perfectly interesting place to set the story for a story written in 1963, but at no point in the course of the story was setting it in the not too distant future justified in any way. It might as well have been set in the 1960s when it was written, or for the way that it was written in the 1940s, which is what it felt like. Um, the one thing that really did jump out at me from this book is the character of Dr. Riker. So he is an elderly gnomish psychologist that it helps the main protagonists, and really he's kind of the hero of the story as it turns out. And his character just tickled me pink. Um, what a weird guy. So the protagonists go to him for physical and psychological help, and the moment that he's got them in sort of a psychoanalysis session to figure out what's going on with them, he immediately starts launching into a monologue bemoaning his choice to become a psychologist, and uh, just um, whining about what he has to deal with um, in his profession, and making the characters feel, I guess, really ashamed that they need his help in the first place, which I think is an amazing tactic. This character was just so quirky and weird that despite all the various flaws of the story, I really did enjoy reading the antics of Dr. Riker. And uh, interspersed throughout the story are some, interesting philosophical ideas about the it the um, eternal nature of the human soul, or the immortal nature of the human soul, not because of personality or appearance, but because of the connections of love and devotion that remain connected beyond death and through time. Something along those lines, which the authors seem to be trying to take an opportunity to explore those concepts, but in the context of this really loosely constructed and hastily composed and sloppily devised story, didn't really work out. But if you ever happen to see this book, just the crazy quirkiness of the Dr. Riker character is worth taking a little bit of time to read it, in my opinion. And for all I know, if my therapist had employed his tactics, I wouldn't be talking to myself right now. So um, the next book that I'll be reviewing is Man Plus by Frederick Pohl. I was looking forward to reading this book. The premise looked really interesting to me, and I waited a little while because I didn't want to do two Frederick Pohl books back to back. So I'm reading this now. Man, this one's tough. It's a big transition from the kind of pulpy action stories that I just read. Um, and I am hopefully going to finish it without falling into utter despair and review it for you next week. Until then, thanks for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll be seeing you.